Welcome to another History and Development video. This time, I'm covering the New Orleans class, America's most numerous class of treaty-era heavy cruisers. Coming after the Portland class, it had to maintain the 10,000-ton weight limit of the Washington Naval Treaty, while also fixing the issues with low protection that had plagued America's early heavy cruisers. For some context on the design, by this point, American ship designers had come to the conclusion that it wasn't possible to make a 10,000-ton heavy cruiser which would be adequate. Achieving their desired mix of armor, speed, and firepower was simply not possible with the weight limit defined by the Washington Naval Treaty. The New Orleans was still designed to be at or under the treaty limit, but closer than previous American heavy cruisers, with a focus on improved armor protection. The overall design was improved in various ways across the board, taking the knowledge gained from the successes and mistakes, mostly mistakes, of the Pensacola, Northampton, and Portland classes to create a more refined class of heavy cruisers. The New Orleans class maintained the same ABSX turret layout as on the Northampton and Portland classes, carrying 9 8-inch or 203mm cannons. These ones were actually considered turrets this time, rather than gun houses, due to a major increase in protection. This layout was decided on with the Northampton class, and it proved to be an effective cannon layout, being repeated on every American heavy cruiser following it, along with ships like the South Dakota, Iowa, and Alaska. The standard anti-air loadout was raised to carrying 8 5-inch or 127mm 25 caliber cannons, an improvement from the 4 initially mounted on previous heavy cruisers. 8 12.7mm machine guns were also mounted, though this would be upgraded later in the war naturally. In 1942, 4 quad 28mm Chicago pianos were added, then the 12.7mm machine guns were replaced with 20mm Oerlikon autocannons. In 1945, the quad 28mm Chicago pianos were replaced with quad 40mm Bofors autocannons, which were far more powerful and reliable. By 1945, the lead ship of the class, USS New Orleans, had its original 8 127mm 25 caliber cannons, 6 quad 40mm Bofors mounts for a total of 24 40mm cannons, and 28 20mm Oerlikon autocannons. This was a massive anti-air loadout for a cruiser, and it would only be surpassed by post-treaty designs that had the displacement to carry more weaponry, such as a Baltimore class, or a few other late war refits, such as those of the Cleveland class. No torpedo launchers were put onto the initial design, as they'd all been removed from the previous American heavy cruisers after completion. The heavy cruisers were designed to fight at such a range that torpedoes wouldn't be particularly useful in combat, though as is seen in the history of this class, they weren't always able to maintain such a distance in combat, leading to this being a questionable decision. The top speed was the same 32.5 knots or 60 km per hour like on the previous heavy cruisers, keeping with the requirements for carrier and convoy escort roles. The range of the ship was 7,600 nautical miles, or 14,075 kilometers, which was lower than the previous American heavy cruisers. It could carry 4 seaplanes for recon, had 2 aircraft catapults, and had a hangar amidships to protect them. Late into the war, one of the 2 catapults would be removed to reduce top weight. The length of the design was 179 meters, or about 588 feet and 2 inches, with a displacement of 10,136 tons, meaning the designers had finally managed to adequately use the entire allotted displacement by the Washington Naval Treaty. It was quite top-heavy, like many US cruisers, which would later impact the upgradability of the class, preventing them from being equipped with the largest and most effective radars that America had to offer, and limiting their lifespan after World War II. Overall, while the New Orleans was a notable improvement over previous ships, it wasn't too different from the Northampton or Portland classes by these stats alone. It's the ship's protection that really stands out as the major improvement. The armor numbers for the New Orleans class are up on the screen, along with a comparison to the Northampton class, the most numerous first-generation American heavy cruiser. Keep in mind, the front and rear magazines have different pelt thicknesses, denoted by an F and R next to them. The most notable uplifts are to the main belt, deck, and turret armor, though everything was generally improved, granting the New Orleans far more survivability in combat. Another thing to note is that the turrets on the earlier American heavy cruisers were considered gun houses due to a severe lack of armor. New Orleans was the first ship to break this trend with heavily protected turrets. USS Quincy and USS Vincennes also received a slightly different turret from the rest of the ships of the class, with a flatter and more angular design reminiscent of later turret designs on ships like the Brooklyn or Baltimore. The forward turret was also moved back 9 feet or 2.7 meters, allowing the belt armor to be shortened, along with the superfiring turret having its barbette armor partially exposed. 7 ships of the New Orleans class were completed: USS New Orleans, USS Astoria, USS Minneapolis, USS Tuscaloosa, USS San Francisco, USS Quincy, and USS Vincennes. The New Orleans class are considered to be the best balance of all the treaty-era heavy cruiser designs. They provided the best mix of firepower, armor, and mobility possible under the Washington Naval Treaty. Of course, the balance of these attributes was still not up to the desired number of the ship designers, which would only be resolved with the onset of World War II removing the need to follow the weight limits. However, that's a topic for another time. Of course, simply going over the stats of the New Orleans doesn't provide the entire story of their practical performance and history. To cover that aspect of the ships, a fellow naval enthusiast and friend of mine, Thomas, will take over from here.
After the destruction of the majority of the American battle line during the raid on Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy had found itself fairly hard-pressed for heavy surface units. In the absence of the majority of its battleships, the role of primary surface combatant more or less fell upon the Navy's many treaty-era heavy cruisers. The New Orleans class, as the most numerous of these treaty cruiser designs, naturally found itself at the forefront of the war's most pivotal battles during the tumultuous year of 1942. Of course, the histories of this class began several years before the start of the war. While their peacetime careers are certainly interesting, I'm only going to cover a short tidbit or two for the sake of time. You're all here for the wartime stuff, I know, we'll get there. One interesting starting note is that at the time these ships went into commission, they weren't actually known commonly as the New Orleans class. Astoria, despite being the second ship to be laid down, ended up being the first put into commission, and as such, the class was known as the Astoria class during the interwar and early war period. While most of their peacetime careers follow a more or less similar trend, Astoria did, in 1939, carry the remains of Japanese Ambassador Saito Hiroshi to Japan, where she was greeted by several Japanese ships with 21-gun salutes. Unfortunately for Astoria, that hospitality would be short-lived. That's called foreshadowing, by the way. When the Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 2 ships of the class were actually present. San Francisco and New Orleans were at anchor in Pearl at the time, and while the Frisco's guns and ammunition were locked and unavailable, New Orleans readily fired on the Japanese, taking light shrapnel damage during the attack. At the same time, Astoria and Minneapolis were then at sea, the latter conducting gunnery practice off Oahu, and Astoria then escorting the carrier Lexington to Wake Island. Quincy, Vincennes, and Tuscaloosa were then present in the Atlantic, undergoing patrols and final outfitting. Only Tuscaloosa would remain there for the majority of the war. In the months immediately following Pearl Harbor, the ships of the New Orleans class played a vital role in carrier escort duties during the war's opening carrier actions. While New Orleans, San Francisco, Minneapolis, and Astoria played the role of guard dogs watching over their carriers, Vincennes arrived just in time to join the fun for the Doolittle raid, and several ships of the class were present at the battles of both Coral Sea and Midway. It was after this period of time that Quincy also joined her sisters in the Pacific, the class collectively forming the bulk of the American surface gunfire element for the upcoming Operation Watchtower, except for Tuscaloosa, of course, who was obviously too cool to take part. The Guadalcanal campaign would see some of the most ferocious fighting in U.S. naval history, and the New Orleans class would bear a large portion of the burden. Less than 48 hours after the initial invasion, on August 9th, Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes were all caught by surprise by a Japanese heavy cruiser force off Savo Island, and then promptly sunk by a torrent of shellfire and torpedoes that likely would have sent almost any ship to the bottom. The ships had not even been ready for combat when the battle started, thanks to a true comedy of errors on the part of Allied intelligence in not realizing that a nighttime surface action was imminent. Regardless of the reason, the class now found itself down 3 ships, all in the span of one night. In the wake of the colossal disaster at Savo Island, the surviving members of the class were forced to step up their involvement. While New Orleans and Minneapolis continued to provide much-needed escort for the vital U.S. carriers, San Francisco was essentially thrust into her moment of glory. Acting as the flagship of Rear Admiral Norman Scott, San Francisco led a cruiser-destroyer force into a night action against the Japanese off Cape Esperance on October 11th. In the ensuing engagement, San Francisco took part in the sinking of the heavy cruiser Furutaka and the destroyer Fubuki, emerging unscathed. She would see action again 1 month later, though this time the same could not be said. On November 12th, San Francisco sailed as the flagship of Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan during an all-out effort to thwart a major Japanese bombardment of Henderson Field. During the day, she was struck by a damaged Mitsubishi G4M in a suicide attack, but remained in action for the upcoming night engagement. In the early hours of the 13th, San Francisco took part in a chaotic and confused melee off Guadalcanal, brawling at point blank with no less than 2 battle cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 11 destroyers. Despite inflicting damage on the Japanese flagship Hiei, including the jamming of her steering, San Francisco was battered from all angles by numerous Japanese ships. Struck over 40 times by shellfire ranging from 5-inch to 14-inch, she miraculously stayed afloat and withdrew, despite the deaths of Rear Admiral Callahan, Captain Cassin Young, and most of her bridge crew. The damage was severe, and she would remain out of action for several months as a result. In the wake of this, Minneapolis and New Orleans were forced to step into the surface combat role for the Battle of Tassafaronga later that month. It didn't end well. Against the Japanese destroyer force, both ships were struck by torpedoes and both were nearly sunk. New Orleans lost everything forward of the number 2 turret, and Minneapolis had everything in front of her forward guns blown off, as well as another torpedo hit aft. Both would survive, and soon joined San Francisco in heading home for repairs. This concluded the class's service off Guadalcanal, but not the war. In the months following, all 3 ships received major refits and repairs before rejoining the war by late 1943. San Francisco had completed repairs by February and returned to the Pacific, serving off the Aleutians until September. Most of the class's service history from this point on involved carrier escort and surface bombardment, notably at islands such as Wake, the Gilberts, and the Marshalls. In February of 1944, New Orleans was given the opportunity to shoot at ships once again, helping sink the light cruiser Katori during the raid on Truk in conjunction with the battleships Iowa and New Jersey. After this, all 3 ships kept up the task of bombardment and carrier escort throughout the Mariana Campaign that summer. San Francisco unfortunately just missed the Battle of Leyte Gulf due to repairs, but New Orleans and Minneapolis absolutely did not. At the WWE SmackDown in the Surigao Strait, Minneapolis had been part of the Allied cruiser gun line, taking part in the sinking of the battleships Fuso, Yamashiro, and crippling the heavy cruiser Mogami and destroyer Shigure. New Orleans, far to the north, was given the opportunity to mop up after the Battle of Cape Engano, sinking the crippled carrier Chiyoda and destroyer Hatsuzuki with gunfire. Now rejoined by San Francisco, the 3 sisters continued their duty as screens for the fast carrier groups, accompanying them on several raids against Japanese installations, as well as providing fire support during the invasions of both Iwo Jima and Okinawa. After this, both New Orleans and Minneapolis were sent to the Philippines to form a squadron there, joined later in July by San Francisco and, surprisingly, Tuscaloosa, in preparation for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. This thankfully never came, and all 4 ships were together at Subic Bay when the cessation of hostilities was announced in August. Tuscaloosa, being the odd one out, remained in the Atlantic for the majority of the war. During early and mid-1942, she trained with the home fleet and guarded convoys, but in November she took part in Operation Torch. During the naval battle of Casablanca, she took part in the bullying of the stationary and incomplete battleship Jean Bart, before withdrawing to refuel and rearm. After this excitement, she continued to escort convoys until mid-1943, later escorting the carrier Ranger during Operation Leader, and repeatedly trying to lure the Tirpitz out of its tricked-out Norwegian man cave. The island of Spitsbergen was retaken on the 19th of October, after which she continued to serve with the home fleet until the invasion of Normandy. Here she provided gunfire support, even engaging in a duel with German coastal batteries later that month in the Battle of Cherbourg. A hasty redeployment to the Mediterranean allowed her to assist in the landings in southern France, after which she returned to the US for a refit before heading over to the Pacific in January of 1945. Here she rejoined her sisters for the final offensives at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, before finally having her respite that summer when they were sent to the Philippines in preparation for Operation Downfall. As we've already covered, they were all there together at the announcement of the Japanese surrender. Unfortunately, despite all the work the class had done, none would survive to be preserved. All 4 survivors would be decommissioned in February of 1946, and all would be scrapped together by 1959. The only remainder of them today can be found in San Francisco in the Golden Gate Recreational Area. Here, one can find the bridge wings of San Francisco, removed during repairs in December of 1942, and bearing the battle damage from her battering at the hands of the Japanese off Guadalcanal on November 13th. San Francisco, New Orleans, and Minneapolis are all among the most decorated warships of the Second World War, earning 17 battle stars each, and with San Francisco taking home the Presidential Unit Citation to boot. Altogether, the class would earn a total of 64 battle stars for their service, proving definitively just how valuable and active they were in some of the most important moments in U.S. naval history.
Thank you for watching. For what ship I'll cover next in this series, I'll put up a poll for that and link it in the comments section, so be sure to vote there for what you want to see next.